You're listening to The Dirt on the Past, a show on history and archaeology and why it matters today. You can find us on the Extreme History Project website and also on kgbm.org. Thanks for listening. Welcome to The Dirt on the Past from the Extreme History Project and KGBM Community Radio.
Whether digging up a site or dusting off the archives, we bring you some of the most fascinating and cutting-edge research in history and archaeology and discuss why it matters today. Join me, Nancy Mahoney, alongside co-host Crystal Alegria, as we converse with anthropologists, archaeologists,
and historians about how they bring the past alive.
Welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we are the co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past, the podcast that delves into lesser-known histories and explores their relevance to modern issues. This week, we're at the Extreme History headquarters speaking in person with Laurel Angell about her research on America's 20th century conservation movement and the missed opportunities that led it to become both exclusionary and politically polarizing. Laurel grew up living in Yosemite National Park and has herself worked as a park ranger before getting a degree in environmental law and then working on conservation policy initiatives under the Obama administration, in which she also served in the House on the Natural Resources Committee. Laurel is currently a doctoral candidate in history at Montana State University and remains active in local and national policy initiatives targeted at creating broader and more inclusive conservation goals. So welcome, Laurel, to The Dirt on the Past.
Thank you. It's great to be here at a social distance.
At a social
absolutely.
distance. Of course, of course.
Thank you for having me.
So full disclosure before we start, Laurel and I met in graduate school, I don't know how many years ago now, maybe 5 or so, and right away, I felt like I had found a friend and somebody with an amazing brain. We took a class with Dr. Billy Smith, who was our very first podcast, and we would have these afternoon seminars, which would then lead into most of the class going out afterwards together. It was an absolutely fabulous time with an amazing group of people. We continued to have some classes and work together with Mark Fiji's Last Best Place Collective at MSU. So it's been super fun working with Laurel and hearing about all her work outside of academia. And so we're so excited to have her here. So thanks again, Laurel, for being here.
Those are some of my best memories, too. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds like so much fun.
It was.
It almost made
you
me want to go
I know.
back to
I tried to
graduate
lure
school.
you back in.
I know.
Billy has told us we were his favorite class.
Really?
I know. I hope he doesn't say that.
I know.
But I like to feel special, but it was one of my very favorite courses. So
I bet
shout
he
out
does.
to Billy Smith again. Yes.
Yeah. I'm sure you guys were. It seems like you had such a great group of people in that class. So,
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, thanks, Laurel, for being here today. And Laurel, in preparation for this podcast, you shared your prospectus with us for your doctoral dissertation. And I was just fascinated how you began that piece with a personal recollection about your childhood. It was such an inviting way to enter this topic on the history of the American conservation movement. You grew up in Yosemite National Park, as Nancy said, in the 1970s. That must have just been so amazing, so wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like and how it shaped who you are and your undergraduate academic goals?
Yeah, it was a pretty cool backyard, I'll tell you that. And I'm thankful both to Mark Fiji and Billy Smith because they actually encouraged me to include that. And, there's always a question about how personal you get that.
Yeah.
But they really felt like that grounded what I was kind of setting out to do. And so I appreciated that encouragement because I wasn't sure if that was the way to go. But yeah, I think, my dad was an early mountaineer before it was cool. In fact, camping, we always used wool.
I was going to say the different gear.
The different gear. And
wool.
so, if you weren't cold and miserable and wet and soggy, like you weren't camping.
Doing it right. Yep.
So I have a great picture of my dad that I actually reference of him in that wool coat, in that wool mountaineering gear. And, for me, I grew up, my dad sort of worship John Muir. And I knew that, and I knew about Yosemite, and I knew about this history of it. And so, growing up, I was either going to get into environmental issues or become a hedge fund manager. I think they go either way.
One way or the other.
But it was definitely instilled in me very young.
That's a lot of what comes out of the national parks. Exactly. Budding hedge fund managers.
Yeah.
I would be a
I
little
have
surprised.
a couple of friends that I grew up with that, are all urban now. They live in New York City. Yeah.
Okay. They have
you kind of go the opposite.
Yeah. But I went to the last one-room schoolhouse in California, and that doesn't mean I'm old. It means that they had it for pretty late. But yeah, my backyard was Half Dome, and growing up in that, and I think I mentioned in my dissertation, we always thought it was odd that tourists would slow down to look at us too.
Yeah,
like the zoo animals or the bears.
We're just playing basketball, what's going on?
Yeah.
But I realized, I had good parents that reminded me how lucky I was, and that was a pretty special place to grow up. And I think, obviously, it instilled in me outdoor values, but I was always very curious about just the stories there. And honestly, it wasn't until coming to MSU where I did start to realize that a lot of those stories were erased. Even with those names, the Ahwahnee, we'd always go to that. And a few years ago, there was a fight over those names in Yosemite. The concessionaire wanted to take back the Ahwahnee and all those names. And there was a really compelling article in the New York Times that said, do we really know where those names come from? And so that kind of resonated with me as somebody that grew up in places, going to Tenaya Lake or the Ahwahnee, but really not having those stories. We had a Pioneer History Center, but we didn't have anything about Native American history there.
Wow. So except the names, that's all you had.
Yeah.
No context.
Yep. Wow. And then the only icons I had to look up to in conservation were John Muir, which everybody will be like, well, that's pretty amazing. But as a young woman, that's what I had. And so I only had a certain set of ideals and ideas to look at growing up.
About what conservation was.
About what conservation is and was, and who it's for.
Right.
And you mentioned, just before we move on from this, I thought you had such an interesting section in there talking about your dad being an engineer, and that he's part of especially this whole period of national parks where the whole point of what he was doing was to make these wild places accessible less wild, to civilize them. Yeah, and my dad actually was an engineer first for the Bureau of Reclamation right after the 1950s when they were building a lot of dams. And so for me, I think this has actually made me better at my conservation work because I have sort of a very complicated way of looking at things, and I think that's because of my dad, because we grew up in California, and I knew all about these canals and ranches and ag, and yet then after that, he moved from Bureau of Reclamation to the National Park Service, and also continued to engineer roads and trails, and very much this idea of making the wild accessible, like you talk about. And so it made for, when I got to college, I remember we read Ed Abbey out of the gate. Right.
And again, the only thing I had to reference.
Another man who wants to just be alone in the wilderness, right? There's that. It's kind of that. Seems like this very American ideal perspective. So it's interesting you read that in college.
Yep.
Do you remember your reaction to that?
I have strong feelings against Ed Abbey. It didn't resonate with me.
Yeah, it just doesn't resonate.
And for me, it made it. I felt, even though I didn't have the language at the time, that he was, he would not welcome me in these areas. And I didn't understand how you could talk about completely excluding people to save them, even though I love this work because I love critters. I want to see the planet safe. I get that piece, but I just didn't see that was a useful conversation. But everybody around me that I worked with in the conservation movement sort of idolized Ed Abbey, but it's an interesting person to idolize.
It's kind of like a line from Muir to Abbey in some ways, of that idea of this really empty spaces, try to have as few people as possible, and what is that for? And never talking about the people that lived in those spaces before. I don't think Ed Abbey ever did that either.
Never.
And neither did Muir at all.
Yeah, and especially it's pretty profound when you think about where Abbey wrote from. which is
where did he write from?
From
Four Corners,
from the Four Corners area,
Okay.
from Utah, from Moab, from Canyonlands, from Bears Ears.
Wow! Oh my gosh!
Which is
just full.
yeah.
You can't walk anywhere without finding
many tribes down there: Navajo, Hopi,
Zuni, all the different.
So huge area. And so it was ironic in my mind. And again, I knew that at the time, but I didn't have the words or the books to look to really think about that.
Mm-hmm. So that's giving us a foreshadowing of what's to come with where your research is going. But so you grew up there, you went to school and studied American Studies, left after that to join the Peace Corps. And then when you came back, you decided to become a park ranger for a while. You were in the Grand Canyon. Tell us a little bit about what led you to that position, and then what eventually led you to leave.
I came back from the Peace Corps and still wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And I actually hadn't considered being in the Park Service since I grew up in it, but it was certainly comfortable. And so I got actually a great position with the Student Conservation Association, working first in the museum collection there at Grand Canyon, which was fun. Pretty amazing. Yeah. During a time where they were trying to learn how to repatriate a lot of the
so we're
Native
talking
American.
In the 90s, right when NAGPRA's passed, and repatriation is the whole. Fascinating.
Yeah. So I was in there and learning a lot, and then just kind of fell in love with the Grand Canyon.
Really?
And
That's
also,
so surprising.
And also,
I just think a lot of people are listening like us. It just sounds like a dream job, at least for a while.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing, and it still actually to me feels like home because it was my first
adult kind of venture.
Yeah.
Where were you in the Peace Corps?
I was in the Seychelles, which is the club med of the Peace Corps.
Oh, my word.
And then went up to Kazakhstan.
Okay, so 2 jackpot jobs in a row. Okay, all right, back to the Grand Canyon.
And worked in the national parks there in the Seychelles. So,
wow.
So I was at Grand Canyon, fell in love with that, also a boy, and so was there for a while. Just
sounds perfectly romantic for a young woman.
Grand Canyon.
We should just stop the podcast.
So I worked as a park ranger, but then I also got a chance because you're always, when you're there, you're going from seasonal job to seasonal job. The Park Service is a little strange that way, but I got a chance and took it to get a permanent job with the superintendent as an assistant, one of his assistants. And from there, I got to watch firsthand sort of the big fights over Grand Canyon. And so I was there during the Clinton administration, and the Secretary of the Interior, who was Bruce Babbitt, was from Arizona. And Grand Canyon, just like Yellowstone here, in fact, both of them were experiencing a lot of controversy at the time around just park use, heavy visitation, wilderness areas, overflights, access. And so I got this firsthand look at all the policies and the natural resource issues.
So there was a reckoning with how to use the park, who could access what should be excluded. So that was all bubbling to the surface in the 90s.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then because it was such a high-profile park, again, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon,
those are kind of
the battlegrounds for a lot of environmental issues.
And I think Clinton announced the Escalante, the new parks from Grand Canyon.
Yes, and
right?
I was actually, the irony is I was actually at that and organizing for the superintendent the event, and they came, and I can say this, that I got most of the calls in backlash to the designation of the Grand Staircase Escalante as a national monument. They did it from Grand Canyon, and there was a lot of controversy around how they did that. And so I just got this great firsthand look at it, and because a lot of people from D.C. were coming, I met a lot of people as well. So, and I am happy to say Bruce Babbitt's staff was mostly women, and I had never seen that.
Wow.
And so that, his chief of staff and everybody in important positions, and that was really interesting for me because I hadn't seen that in coming up in the Park Service in particular. And so I was drawn both to that and then these policy battles. And the Grand Staircase Escalante, what happened there really got me hooked that I wanted to work in a policy legal way on these issues.
Kind of get underneath
Yeah.
what was going on
Yeah.
from the outside, not just
Yeah.
from within
Yeah.
the Park Service, which seems fascinating to me because you grew up in a park where you probably weren't aware, or there wasn't even those kinds of controversies about Yosemite or anything. And then by the time you come
Right.
back as young, you are just swamped
Yeah.
with it. It's in the middle
Yeah.
of big change.
Yeah. I just thought everybody loved parks.
Yeah.
Right. There's
And
no
everybody
issue.
does love parks, but they have a lot of
They do.
disagreements
But-
about how
Yes.
you do.
Yeah,
Yes.
that
those
and that
issues.
is because everybody loves parks,
Yeah.
but everybody sees them in such a different way.
Yeah.
So that's part of that.
Yeah. So it certainly began, it's been an evolution since then, but I will say I did end up working on the legislation to shepherd, when I was in the Congress, to shepherd what's called the National Landscape Conservation System, which is the system for all the monuments now that are designated. And so it was ironic to go from that first Grand Staircase to actually being in charge of the legislation to make Grand Staircase and other monuments a system of lands akin to the national parks.
Fascinating. And a lot of this happened under the Antiquities Act?
They designated under the Antiquities Act, and the idea of the legislation was to make sure they remained permanent and not just able to write it, any president.
Not just
could
an
write it
executive
off.
order could be undone.
Right.
Could undo that, right?
Okay.
Right.
Which has only recently become relevant. Yeah.
Right,
Yes.
right. So as you were, seeing all these things, participating in them, being part of this, seeing this policy enacted, you started thinking about pursuing a law degree.
Yeah.
And you did that. So
Right.
what motivated you? At that time, you did have specific ideas about how the law could help advance conservation policy, and you were seeing some of these things in action, really, with your work at the Grand Canyon. So, tell us more about that. Tell us how you got into that, and where that led you.
Yeah, I had a chance to go up further in the Park Service, but I was really, I think I was really excited about the people that I saw coming to the park from DC, the policies being, the policy making around that park, and I wanted to be a part of it from a legal point of view. And so I really had a focus on going into natural resource and environmental law. Although my second year I watched way too many criminal procedures, so I was like, maybe I'll do criminal law.
Yeah, but that
that's
kind
all
of
entertainment
reeled you
law.
in.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I came to my senses. But definitely that time of having that front row seat at Grand Canyon and watching those issues play out, it absolutely drove me to want to work on public lands issues in the West in particular. But I definitely wanted to go to D.C. and try and work on legislation to protect these places. Mm-hmm. And I was very interested in endangered species and critters, and we weren't so aware necessarily of climate at the time, but just the wilderness parks, monuments, pieces, protective areas.
How did you get your foot in the door with the powers that be in D.C.? Through your law degree, or was there?
I actually had an interesting, lucky break in that I took a fellowship with another Vermont Law School alum, worked for Senator Cantwell from Washington. So I actually went on to the Judiciary Committee first in the Senate side, right after 9/11. So I got to watch the Patriot Act go through that committee, and so I actually had this great, interesting, completely different introduction.
But you learned a lot about procedure, maybe, in this Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
that still had some of the old lions of the Senate, Kennedy, and or Orrin Hatch, who's still there. But it was a sort of, we were watching an era as well. Right. And so I was there for a lot of interesting moments, and and got very lucky there. And then from there was able to move into the issues that I really wanted to work on, although I was really lucky to have that moment.
Nice.
Yeah, and that was in the early 2000s?
Yep.
Okay.
Right after 9/11.
Right after 9/11.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was when the Senate was still split, so just like right now, it was an interesting time.
Because you could maybe make some coalitions and
they were really
passed.
working, you know, together in a very tense time.
Yeah.
With right after 9/11, and with election ahead. It was an interesting time, and everybody was worried, obviously, about security and things like that. And we were on the Judiciary Committee. So.
Wow. So as part of that, you were able to work on a policy initiative that we've talked about, and one of the ways I first got to know you, because it was just getting passed and getting a lot of news when I first met you. So the greater sage grouse conservation policies, and to be fair, I didn't really know a lot about the sage grouse. Go ahead.
And I have to say, I don't know much about the sage grouse situation.
Well, my husband is an avid birder, and he would just be ashamed of me saying that.
Everybody should Google sage grouse dance.
Okay. I did that. That was one of the first things Laurel told me to do, and I was in love from there on. It is an amazing, beautiful bird with this gigantic display, and then it dances to find a mate, and that's a whole other podcast. But this, what I want to get at is this was a fascinating process that you were involved in. It was a bird, the greater sage grouse, was removed from the endangered species list in 2015, but habitat was still threatened in the West, various parts of the West, as it is for many other critters. And so there was a new way of sort of building coalition and strategies to achieve protection that didn't necessarily come at the expense of rural landowners and other people who didn't want more restrictions put on their land. So tell us a little bit about that, because I think this is one of those examples of a way forward, and you were at the helm there with this. So.
Yeah, and fast forward, I had left Congress and was running what's called the Western Energy Project, which was a project of the Hewlett Foundation, which set out to do large landscape level protections. So, but you mentioned the Grand Staircase Escalante. That was very controversial, and was for years and is still now, right? Very controversial.
And is part of that because of the way it was done?
The way it was done.
All right.
And,
who was left out maybe of the discussion?
And that a lot of people didn't feel that they were at the table, and I think that's a fair criticism of it. It was done quickly. And so a lot of what I learned from that, and then, throughout my time in Congress was, that you can do these things, but if you can, building those broader coalitions is better. And we had a very controversial issue with this bird that we did call, though I'm going to hear from birders and everybody else like that, we called it the anxious chicken. It's a beautiful, beautiful bird, but it gets super nervous when things are bigger than it, so it doesn't like oil and gas wells, and it actually doesn't like windmills either. So equal opportunity hater of energy.
Bigger critters, it's bigger anything, bigger infrastructure.
Right.
Okay.
And its habitat is lost due to climate change and development and everything that we know about that is challenging right now. And so it was endangered, but the idea of listing it meant that a lot of things could be disrupted. And so we wanted to see if we could work together to build across 11 states plans to preserve its habitat. And in doing so, we just found common ground with a lot of people, because we talked about as the bird goes, so does the herd. So for hunters and anglers, keeping that habitat intact is important. And, ranchers and farmers as well, traditionally at odds with environmentalists, but wanting to save their working lands, wanting to have certainty with how they manage the lands. So we found a lot of commonality there. We also engaged the recreation economy. They want to see healthy, thriving lands as well. So we worked just to build that broader coalition. And out of that came, across the 11 western states, very strong plans and strong federal plans that are in place to this day. And it is seen as a model of how to build enough support that you can kind of keep these things moving ahead no matter who's in charge at the federal level, because so a lot of people are built in.
Right. 11 states, were they having to pass legislation as well as federal legislation got passed? So it was kind of a quilt of different...
Yes, it was very challenging, and I think it's safe to say that politically everybody didn't like each other. And so the states all had to pass plans, and then the federal government had to pass plans, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service had to decide if those plans were good enough to preserve the bird. And then environmental groups had to decide if it was good enough or if they would sue.
Oh,
and
goodness,
so
right, because
there
you
was
don't
a
want to
lot,
pass all that and then
yeah.
have these lawsuits.
And
Okay.
and there was a lot of controversy. It was during the Obama administration, a lot of backlash, but we really worked on the ground with local communities to try and bring everybody to the table on these plans, based actually on great success in the state of Wyoming, where they managed to do that, because they realized that it was in everybody's best interest to keep the bird, thriving, or at least surviving in places, and to keep that habitat. It was good for everybody's way of life out here.
Right.
There was something everyone could find in it that was
Yeah.
so a way not to pit people against each other.
Yeah.
But
And the Obama administration, no matter what anybody thinks politically, they were very much invested in across the board building support for a lot of these efforts.
interesting, you were in a working for a private foundation that was able to achieve that with a variety of different governmental entities that you had to work with. So definitely a public-private kind of big partnership and coalition. Amazing, and I think it sets up a model for other ways to do things. So before we move on, we just want to take a quick station break. You are listening to The Dirt on the Past with co-hosts Nancy Mahoney and Crystal Alegria on KGVM Bozeman. We are listening today with Laurel Angell about her background growing up in Yosemite National Park and the path that led her to her current research on America's conservation movement, specifically regarding missed opportunities that led it to become both exclusionary and politically polarizing.
All right. Well, thanks, Laurel, again for being here with us to talk about this. And now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about your research that you're doing right now at Montana State University, which is so exciting. And your current research is based on the premise that American ideals of preservation and conservation are failing, and that we can no longer just set aside chunks of land or water as protected spaces that will stay unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And that last line is from the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916. So that was what is said in that act. But you're not the only historian or activist to call our attention to the fact that the conservation movement is really at a crossroads at this point in time. And really at a crossroads in this last year, I would say, last couple of years. But for those of us getting up to speed like myself, I don't follow the conservation movement as much as probably Nancy does. I think you do more than I do. And of course you, Laurel. But tell us about which ideals specifically are failing and what myths have been foundational to the notion of conservation as wild landscapes devoid of human encroachment. So thinking about these wild places, these places as devoid of humans.
Sort of the John Muir,
Yeah,
Ed
the
Abbey
John Muir,
kind of,
Ed Abbey
yeah.
that we started with, these places that are, so.
Yes, and if it's okay, I'll just back up really quickly because it'll get us there. But in the last few years of the Obama administration, the president was very much committed to restoring stories of communities of color and Indigenous through the Antiquities Act in particular, and monuments. And so I was a part of an effort to work to facilitate thought leaders from communities of color, Indigenous, tribal leaders coming together to really put on the table their stories.
And let me just interject for a minute, because what you're saying is, for people who don't know, part of the Antiquities Act, which is very important, is it allows the president to set aside places that they can be natural places, but they can also be places where heritage has happened. And so the idea was that we probably didn't have very many places set aside that represented important spaces for Indigenous people, other people of color, African Americans. Mm-hmm. And that's something that could be done. It isn't about always taking big chunks of land out of the West. It can just be designating national landmarks and monuments as a way to preserve and recognize parts of our past history. Okay.
And the 1906 Antiquities Act was intended, in theory, to protect cultural areas, but it had been used to put aside large tracts of land and didn't really talk about those stories. And so the Obama administration really used the Antiquities Act to restore stories. So Cesar Chavez, they did Freedom Riders, they did the LBGTQ monument in New York City. I'm forgetting the name of it.
Oh, right, where it was down in
Stonewall.
Stonewall. Yes,
Yeah,
the bar.
Stonewall.
Yeah, fantastic. So this all happened under Obama.
Yeah, and so he used the last few years to really try and restore and use the Antiquities Act very deliberately to restore the stories that we hadn't been telling, and to use the Antiquities Act to push the environmental groups to really think more broadly about engaging beyond sort of their idea of conservation, which was very much a colonial structure,
Right.
and was, brought from both privilege and that colonialism of drawing lines around places and excluding people to protect those places. And we can have a much more complicated conversation about that, and I've obviously simplified, but the idea of conservation was, here's a park, here's a wilderness area, here's this. And largely those parks were predicated, and these areas were predicated on the removal of Indians.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the Obama administration to start to restore stories that had been erased was fairly significant. And in doing so, he really empowered a lot of different groups to start to engage in conservation. And so that really got me thinking, because, again, my early career was John Muir, right?
Right.
And so I never had anything to look at as much. And so I remember the first conversation I had was with Carolyn Finney, who wrote Black Faces, White Spaces.
Oh, and she came to speak at MSU. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Her book is amazing. Yeah.
And this was a group of thought leaders that were really pushing the conservation movement, environmental movement, to be less exclusive. It is still and was a very middle-class, privileged white movement. And that's some of the ideas I'm interested in, is how that happened. But Carolyn, I said, what is your vision for our public lands and stories? And she said, nobody's ever asked me that before.
Really? Wow.
And so that was just a aha moment for me, because I realized, and I'm part of that movement, right? I'd been working in that too. And I realized there were so many stories I didn't even know. Mm-hmm. And so I think that really did drive me to think about this as my dissertation. I'm getting to the questions, but
no, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's such an interesting what you're doing, and what I think you're part of a cadre of historians and activists and new voices that I think what we thought of as historic heritage preservation as being separate from environment and nature, because this long-held idea that nature is not about humans, it's about protecting. Now you're saying there's this whole other way, and when we start talking about Indigenous Americans, people of color, there's a very different way of thinking about landscape conservation, preservation spaces.
Right.
And very interesting the way you say under Obama there was this deliberate way to think differently about conservation and preservation, that you then had a different turn, and having those conversations with people who had never been asked what they thought. Okay, so...
And that, I will say, that coincided with me coming here. I moved here from BC, and I wanted to get back into history. I thought I wanted to teach and all those reasons, but what I realized is once I came to the history department, and Billy Smith's class actually was the first sort of like, wow, things have really changed and this is interesting. All of a sudden I realized there was a whole set of materials for me to really think about and articulate what I was seeing was wrong, right? What I knew was starting to happen with the conservation movement, what I couldn't put words on, what I couldn't quite fathom. Now I walk into MSU with a set of people that are talking about these things very openly, and there's a real disconnect, but to have those conversations about race, removal, all those stories, all of a sudden I had this whole set of tools to really
very
think about
open
it.
with a large group of people wanting to think, all these environmental historians and different groups. Me bringing just a background in archaeology and anthropology, I was fascinated to delve into that as well. I feel like it was a very eye-opening conversations were happening at a very high level. And for me, what I thought was fascinating was there, but you also had that foot outside of academia in really looking at policy and in that world to see how that's going, how changes could be made on the ground. So your research for your dissertation covers a 100-year period you lay out between sort of 1916, which is the beginning of creating the Park Service as we know it. When the National Park Service Organic Act was passed in 1916, it was an effort to finally fund a management of parks that had been created earlier, with Yellowstone and Yosemite being these early ones, but there was no money behind it to figure out what is this thing and how do we fund it. So 1916, that's a beginning point for you, and you sort of take it 100 years through 2016. So starting there, what were those missed opportunities you want to explore that from the outside of creating the Park Service and all of that energy and excitement about the conservation and environmental movement sort of had its beginning at that point? So who was left out during the establishment of the national parks, or who was negatively impacted by that movement?
Right. Yeah, we're looking at the Organic Act there. I am looking at the Organic Act, and then, and that is really kind of coincides with the start of the conservation movement. John Muir does a lot of his thinking and writing around that time. So these are in motion together. And
sort of a groundswell to be able to get all this passed. Yeah.
So I thought about, we were looking to say, how do we... I wanted to start there and end with the Sunrise Movement, which is the young climate movement right now that thinks about race, equity, social, economics.
Very new activists.
Yeah, so, I got the go-ahead to do that. But I think we were starting to look at who was left out. So I started first with the Organic Act, and I've been looking at the NAACP papers, like were they talking about conservationists? We know W.E.B. Du Bois actually has a lot around conservation, but why were they left out? But Mark and my committee has had me sort of start to focus right now on the 1964 Wilderness Act and the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
I think that is a fascinating juncture of what was going on, and was there any relationship? So what are you finding?
We're starting to, I keep saying we. I feel like my committee are my people. So.
And I'm just telling them what to do. If only that was how we got our PhD.
Right.
I am starting to look at essentially, so you've got this progressive movement that at the time was led by a very charismatic conservationist named David Brower, who ran the Sierra Club. So I'm looking at the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society archives, as well as NAACP. We're starting to look at what the conversations, was the Sierra Club actually talking about the civil rights movement? What about the Red Power movement? All of these things are happening at the same time.
Such a dynamic period in our
history. And so what we know is that conservation has narrowed, and it's become a white upper class movement, and that's why it's having its reckoning now. We kind of thought, okay, it's back here, but I think it's during this period of these social movements. And what happened? How did these conversations not happen with all these progressive movements? And what clues? And I'm still in the middle of it, but I think we are going to see some interesting things. And you have a landmark, iconic act being passed for conservation. The Wilderness Act is, sacred, and yet it's problematic because it talks about,
places untrammeled,
and it thinks about, and doesn't say this, but I mean, it's basically, again, about the removal of the people that were on the land.
The act itself, the language in the act itself, has been held up to sound very beautiful
Right.
and romantic and poetic, but actually it is an act of erasure. There are no places untrammeled by man. I mean,
Right.
the new ice patch archaeology, every time you talk to Indigenous people and you talk to archaeologists, there are no places untrammeled.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it's a fiction that we've created in our minds that we could, as you said, draw a circle around a place. So that is going on at the same time you're saying this conversation may be driven or spurning on people like the Sierra Club. What is the demographics of who is in the Sierra Club? Who are those people?
It's upper white, wealthier, mostly males. Mm-hmm. And same with the Wilderness Society. Mm-hmm. You don't see a lot of females in any of the pieces. I mean, more sort of tokenized.
So a gender and racial sort of bias towards just white males.
Yeah, and I think I'll probably get at the gender piece too at some point in time, which is very significant, certainly for myself,
right,
as somebody who didn't have anybody to look to growing up in the movement.
Right.
And so the question for me is, are they actively excluding, or is it that it just wasn't attracting because of the nature of what it is, any other broader groups, because their focus was so narrow and exclusive in and of itself? It's a chicken and egg kind of thing for me. And I suppose you'll be uncovering.
Hopefully. I think that's a big question. I think there are signs that part of that was deliberate, and I think that's going to be uncomfortable. But I think that's real. And, and
people who are fighting for their equal rights to vote, to enter spaces that were formerly segregated, is there energy left over to worry about setting aside lands to be excluding humans, in essence?
And Billy Smith is on my committee, and I think this is a big question. But, I mean, what's coming home right now is the access, right now in a time of COVID, to open space and the environmental justice part of this, I think makes more important than ever just the ramifications of the segregation of this movement.
Right.
Because, I mean, we are, a lot of people are doing well because they have access to the outside and things like that. And that's been a big piece of the inequity, is access. And that's the push on the conservation movement right now that's super uncomfortable is, the environmental justice, racial inequity. And I think, I think it's very damaging that we narrowed the movement at that time.
So do you think it was a little more open in 1916 and it narrowed in the 60s? Was it a little broader coalition, or do you think it started out very narrow and then continued on that path to be even more sort of elite and white and male?
I think it sort of definitely started out elite and white and male. I think there was an opening there. I think there could have been with the Park Service. I think I will see those missed opportunities. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I think there was real opportunity there. Not for Indigenous, I don't think, but I think, and I think that's tackling all this piece is going to be, because there's a lot going on here. But I think, I'll find that, I think with this 1960s period, we'll see that those turns really undermined the work. Ultimately, even though in 1970 you see this slew of laws, iconic environmental laws, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species, Clean Air, National Environmental Policy Act, they have wild success, but it continues to narrow. And what Obama administration pushed the conservation movement is, you're becoming more and more exclusive, and I'm not going to be a president that does that, right? We're not narrowing down and drawing these lines around places. You
or
should be
around
broadening
species,
the movement.
and just pushing so hard on particular issues that weren't including the needs and the thoughts of a broader coalition of people. Whether that be rural landowners or whether that be ag folks, and people of color.
Yeah, and that's an important part of it too, and I think there's what I've been pushed to look at too is the class piece. Yeah. And so all of that is a lot, and I'm still doing the research, but I think I'll have to pick something at some point in time.
So are you going to be talking to these people, Laurel? Are you going to have some oral history interviews within this? Is that kind of what you're going to start working on? I know you've done a lot of research already, documentary research, but
slowly but surely on the documentary research. But I think one of the things that my experience has brought me is a lot of good networking, and so I plan to, start to do a series of interviews. Mark, I plan to start to do.
We're talking Mark Fiji here, who we're shouting out to.
Just my committee
Mark,
chairman. I'm trying
maybe
to keep
we
it
can
online.
enter this in as a footnote.
Exactly.
Right. There we go.
So that's a big part of it, and I'm excited about that part of it. And I think I'm going to run into, what I know from still being in the movement is there is a pushback right now on, wilderness is good. It's a great tool. We used it really well, but I think it's okay to say this was a tool of the past and we've got to open it up. But I think I am going to see a lot of people really struggling because, they've been fighting for lands and conservation
and it'll be a turn. So let me reframe some of these questions so we get into more recent history, more recent past. One pivotal thing that I read in graduate school, that you read in graduate school, was William Cronin's The Trouble with Wilderness.
The Trouble with Wilderness.
Right, and that's something you cite in your dissertation. And the idea is that wilderness is a cultural construct. It's not really something that existed, and our ideas of what wilderness means, that words, have changed from being this scary place where the devil roamed, biblical history, to this place that's untrammeled by man, but also is a place where we find our true selves. And it's this very kind of idea associated with the American West in particular, but in some ways with Thoreau and that whole movement of a sort of existentialist with, so I think there's this very interesting American history tied up in that. But even today, I'll be at dinner sometimes with a group of people, and I will mistakenly say, well, wilderness is a cultural construct, and I will get blank stares, and I'll have to then backtrack and kind of pretend I didn't say that. So I see exactly what you're saying, right? So there's circles in which people have read and thought and talked about that and have moved past about what do we do now. And then there's not everybody. So moving on from that, you talk about there is a big backlash today against climate change and against many broader environmental goals, which Americans often see as job-killing policies, things that are damaging to the economy, and a waste of natural resources that we should be using or extracting. So you have this backlash against extractive economies, and then you have other people backlashing against the environmental controls that prohibit those extractions. And this sentiment really seems to stretch back to the Reagan administration, where it sort of coalesced, and then it persists to the present. And in talking with anybody, it seems kind of weird. Everybody wants clean air and clean water, and everybody wants economic opportunities. So when are we going to figure this out and get past the polarizing rhetoric? I mean, I think this history that you're exploring can help us get past that rhetoric, because maybe we can understand it in a different way, or we can understand how that polarizing rhetoric got formed. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and then how it maybe could point us to a way forward,
Yeah. And for your dinner parties, I would say just quote Carolyn Finney, who said, "Let's just start with all the lands are stolen."
Yes, that is a
beautiful
quote. That is sure to
every
make
now
me
and
miss
then,
dessert. I'm sure that
every now and then you put that down, and I actually think that's a good place
just start from
to begin
there.
the conversation.
And the thing is, it is in America. Yeah. It is this truth that I think a few other countries grapple with, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and how we deal with it is fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. And Cronin got big pushback from the environmental community for that.
Right.
And and even a year ago, I was with somebody who used to run the Wilderness Society, and he's like, and Cronin was on the board, and he goes, "Yeah, well, we had them back off of that.
Oh, interesting.
And so, it's a scary concept. And I think it's scary because of what you just asked me. So, I mean, we've been politically and, for environmental issues, and this goes way back. This is a class issue. This is how people were removed from the land, how we put these systems into place. It has set up this jobs versus the environment rhetoric. And it got really bad, like you said, in the Reagan administration, which was a backlash to all the 1970s suite of laws. And
the Sagebrush Rebellion.
The Sagebrush Rebellion, which is alive and well today with
Absolutely.
the Bundys. And, and with, some of the people that were part of the Capitol insurrection. And so that is significant, and it makes these issues volatile at times, obviously, from the spotted owl controversy to Malheur. So, I mean, I think what is most interesting to me, and because of this conversation, is why certain groups did decide we've got to really broaden support for conservation. Because you still have a faction of conservationists and then environmental justice over here, and none of those work together. And so,
they're not aligned. They haven't found a way to.
No, and I think right now we're starting to see it.
Okay. So you're saying things have maybe really changed in the last year in particular?
Absolutely. With I think like most social movements, but the George Floyd murder had a real impact on a community that was already struggling with its history of racism and exclusion and white wealthy privilege. And Michael Brune, who runs the Sierra Club, about 6 months ago, came out in an article and said, let's recognize what John Muir was.
Mm-hmm.
He himself was, would you call him a racist?
That's a whole different conversation. His writings, I think he, I think things have been written here about John Muir, and I think we've been afraid to call him a racist.
He's been on such a pedestal.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and I think everybody is afraid that if you do that, then you're going to lose sight of all
that something
these
else will
tenuous
collapse,
battles.
and that
And I think what Michael Brune
all
did
our
was,
heroes are flawed.
Yeah,
No matter what
right.
hero you're talking about, no matter which side of the political, they're all flawed. And for sure, I think we're better off telling the whole story and owning it.
Yeah, and Dorceta Taylor wrote.
She's amazing.
She wrote this conservation history about, and really took it to John Muir on this. So it's not that was news to anybody. It's just really uncomfortable. And then for the guy who runs the Sierra Club to come out and say, let's
Because
do
John
this,
Muir was the founder of the Sierra Club.
I think it is news to people, though. Still, it's not news to
Well,
everybody.
yeah.
Right?
To be fair, it was news. I think the environmental movement was struggling with this because, one, you're reckoning with that racism in the past, but two, they're politically afraid of what they're going to lose.
Right.
And at a time where they were under attack. So I think there was a lot going on. But to your question, unless we broaden support and unless we embrace and different ideas of conservation, different ways of doing this work, unless we make the movement more equitable, we're going to continue in that fight.
Right. And we're going to just continue to narrow and narrow.
Right. Exactly. And have
it'll
just
be
this
lost.
narrow job versus environment. Because you're
right.
right, everybody cares about clean water and things like that.
Yeah.
But we haven't made that argument. And the only way we've made the argument over the past 10 years are to put the recreation economy against the extractive economy, which further
that
has...
pits exactly and polarizes, and you end up in court all the time
Right.
over all these things, which is why you were saying, getting back to the sage-grouse, you wanted to create this patchwork quilt that didn't trigger a lot of backlash and court cases, and that seems that's the only way to go forward. So conservation, you're saying, really has to broaden their umbrella to include a lot of different ideas about, I mean, this gets at fundamentally what we think of nature. What we do we see it as something separate from ourselves, and then what's it for? And of course, this is going to include environmental justice because we have such a history of exclusion.
Yeah. Well, and already we're looking at, over the past few years with wildfire, what is the Yurok tribe doing? Like, we're basically like, oh, hey, that's some pretty good ideas.
Yeah, let's look to them.
By starting to stop holding on to this idea, this one structure of conservation, can we actually bring in new ideas? Mm-hmm. And then by embracing a climate movement that has been pushing the conservation movement to understand that environmental, like climate change is not an environmental problem, it's a race problem, it's an equity problem, it's an economic, social problem, it's all of those. And that young movement has pushed an older movement to understand that they can't, it's pushing them out of that comfort zone, and it's pushing them to understand they cannot make inroads unless the movement and the laws and the ideas and the tools are more equitable. And that's a good thing, because we can't do this in a narrow place. Otherwise, we end up in that same argument.
Right. Mm-hmm. Have you been hearing about Heather Mcgee's book, The Sum of Us, which is all over right now? She's doing a book tour, and it was her amazing research and data showing that racist policies end up costing us more, literally, economically. And all the things we do want, clean air, clean water, safe healthcare system, all of those things could be achievable if we didn't have all these strange policies. And she talks about, back to your point about sort of the exclusions of nature, she recounts a story in Montgomery, Alabama of a beautiful big either city or county park that had a gigantic swimming pool and a zoo and all these associated open spaces. But in the 1960s, when they had to integrate, they drain and backfill the pool and bury it, and they sell off all the animals because they don't. So this idea that it's a zero-sum game, she's saying, is not how you go forward. And it seems the same with these things about extraction versus recreation or jobs versus the environment. We act like it's a zero-sum game.
Right.
And we write it that way.
Yeah.
But you sound hopeful. You sound hopeful that we have a way forward, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at potentially seeing our first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior.
Right.
Wow, that's right.
Which is profound, really. And she's amazing. And I think,
So she's qualified, and she's a symbol for
right.
something new.
Yeah, I mean, being in charge of the agency that...
The Interior Department.
It is in charge of the lands that were stolen.
That were stolen.
And so I think, and she has brought forward, as has this administration, both ideas of climate but also equity. They see an overlap, that conservation and environmental, they're bringing these ideas that a young movement has pushed them towards and that an older movement is reckoning with. And they're putting them into play right now. And so I think it'll be interesting to not have environmental justice over here and climate over here and conservation over here, but what does it look like if we come together? And Deb Haaland, who's the Interior Secretary nominee for this administration, has also made it clear that that she wants to look at ideas of co-management. What does tribal management look like? And that's scary for a lot of groups because, again, there's this idea of we've got this and we better hold on to it because it's under threat. So I think there's going to be a lot of push, but I think it's good.
Because it forces people to talk to each other more. Right. I mean, archaeologists had to go through this passing NAGPRA, and everyone thought it would be the end of the discipline. And I think we've seen nothing but better and more interesting collaborations. And we even now in Montana, we have... the latest president of the MAS is now the Crow Chippo, so Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, who we also did a podcast with. So yay us.
So if my piece can make, I think my goal, one is curiosity. I think it's made me a stronger advocate, the work that I've done within the history department. But I hope I can tell this story in a way that does bring to light, because I think it is okay to understand this and engage it. And I think if we can come to terms with that, we can actually take on saving this planet. And I know that sounds goofy, but we've got real work to do. And we can't do it if we're just narrowing all the time.
If we're ignoring race and class and the way that they've been excluded, we're not going to get there.
And better understanding this history. So thanks for doing this work, Laurel. I think it's so critically important right now, especially. And I have to say, I grew up near a park, a national park as well. I grew up near Yellowstone National Park. I did not grow up inside the park like you did, but it was definitely in my backyard. And I grew up learning that there was no people historically that lived in the park, nor were there people ever, historically in the park.
Right.
And so I'm so glad we're rewriting that history because, of course, that's completely wrong.
Yeah.
There was people in the park for thousands and thousands of years.
Yep.
And so our colleagues, Shane Doyle, Elaine Hale, Doug McDonald, just wrote an article about, or just were interviewed for an article about that in the Smithsonian Magazine, and spoke very eloquently about that, about Yellowstone National Park. And Doug McDonald and Elaine Hale are archaeologists who have done all this amazing archaeology in the park, finding that people were, of course, living there for thousands of years. And Shane Doyle is a member of the Crow Nation, and of course, his oral history tells him that the Crow people were there for thousands of, or have not thousands and thousands of years, but for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. So it's important that we rewrite this history. We better understand this history, and we move forward with new knowledge in how we look at these places that are sacred to all of us.
Yes.
Yeah, and it changes how we think about them.
Yeah,
I think, and what we do with them.
Yeah,
it does.
And I feel hopeful for where the conservation movement is trying to go. And it's hard, and it's a generational and...
I think you really hit on that with that sunrise movement. My daughter is 16, and she's fierce, and I see that in that generation. Yep. It's wonderful to see that energy and that feeling of, well, why can't we just get this done?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and just one really quick story. I ended up in training the other day in my job of Indigenous governments that a conservation group is doing with Native American colleges, and it was really an important shift. And they started out with having everybody do homework about where they grew up and whose lands those were.
Right. Nice.
And what we know too is that nobody got a lot of the history. So not only was it parks, but across the board.
Oh, right, across the board.
And so that was really interesting. And so I think I have a lot of hope there, and I definitely have to have hope for the planet right now, because we got to do something. But I think dealing with these issues is great. Right. So thank you for this opportunity to be here today. Well,
thanks, Laurel. Thanks. We're so glad that you came and sat with us. This has been a really fun and important look at this movement. Thanks for taking the time, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us today, and we hope you can join us again next time to find out more about the Dirt on the Past.
If you're enjoying the Dirt on the Past, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Also, please tell your friends and leave us a review. It really helps people find us. We are a new podcast and trying to grow our listener base, so please share. Thanks, and thanks for listening.
You've been listening to The Dirt on the Past, a podcast of the Extreme History Project and Gallatin Valley Community Radio, KGVM. To hear more episodes, visit our website at theextremehistoryproject.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep searching out the dirt on the past.